In this true crime documentary, we will cover one of Ireland's most notorious and ruthless gangs. The Collopy gang emerged in Limerick City during the late 1990s, originating from a strategic partnership with the established Keane crime family. Based in the St. Mary's Park estate, the Collopys entered the illicit drug trade at a time when violent feuding had begun escalating throughout Limerick's underworld. According to local accounts, the Collopy crew initially clashed with Christy and Kieran Keane, brothers who commanded a lucrative drug operation by intercepting and selling off a consignment of the Keanes' drugs. Rather than responding with violence, Christy Keane recognized the Collopys' effectiveness at moving product and recruited them as partners instead. This alliance formed the Keane-Collopy gang, which became one of two dominant family-based criminal organizations in Limerick, the other being the McCarthy-Dundon faction. By 2000, however, the Keane-Collopy partnership had descended into a bitter internal feud. A personal dispute, reportedly sparked by a schoolyard fight between a daughter of Christy Keane and a daughter of his lieutenant Eddie Ryan, led to a serious falling out. In November 2000, Eddie Ryan, formerly the Keane gang's chief enforcer, turned against Christy Keane and ambushed him outside a school in a failed assassination attempt when his gun jammed. 2 nights later, retaliation came swiftly. As 40-year-old Eddie Ryan drank in Limerick's Moose Bar, 2 masked gunmen entered and shot him dead. Ryan's son, who accompanied him, narrowly escaped by stepping away moments before the shooting. The gunmen were believed to be Kieran Keane and Philip Collopy, signaling that the Keane-Collopy gang had eliminated their renegade ex-ally. This incident ignited what became known as the Limerick Feud, a vicious gangland war that gripped the city for over a decade. Christy Keane was widely regarded as the founding figure of the Keane-Collopy gang and served as its original leader. A native of St. Mary's Park, Christy Keane built a major narcotics enterprise in Limerick during the 1990s. In 2001, he was caught with nearly 20 kilograms of cannabis and received a 10-year prison sentence, serving approximately 7 years. While incarcerated, Keane's criminal empire was managed in part by the Collopy family. He survived multiple attempts on his life, including a high-profile shooting in June 2015 when 2 gunmen ambushed him at the University of Limerick campus. Keane was shot several times, but survived. The Collopy brothers formed the core of the gang, with 6 or 7 brothers from the extended Collopy family serving as Christy Keane's close associates and later as power brokers in their own right. Several rose to senior leadership positions. Brian Collopy, born in the early 1970s, was one of the eldest brothers and served for years as a key figure in the gang's drug operations. He survived an assassination attempt in 2006 when he was shot twice on a Limerick street. He later served prison time for witness intimidation, specifically an 8-year sentence, reduced to 6 on appeal, for threatening state witness Willie Moran in 2010. Brian's luxurious home, Ashby House in Fedamore, County Limerick, was seized by the Criminal Assets Bureau as part of a €470,000 settlement. In December 2015, Brian was caught with his brother Kieran cutting up a €50,000 batch of heroin. They pleaded guilty and each received an 8-year prison term in 2016. Described by authorities as at the top end of the drugs pyramid in Limerick, Brian remained a major target for law enforcement. He was nearing the end of that sentence by 2020 and has since been released, though police suspected he was eager to resume trafficking activities. Kieran Collopy, born in the mid-1970s, was Brian's younger brother and longtime second-in-command. He built a reputation for ruthless intimidation. In 2011, Kieran and his brother Damien were each jailed for 5 years for making death threats against Willie Moran. Like Brian, he was caught in the December 2015 heroin raid and received an 8-year sentence for drug trafficking. As of mid-2020, Kieran, then about 44 years old, was approaching the end of that prison term. His scheduled release prompted Gardaí to launch Operation Coronation, a large sweep against the gang's assets and remaining members, in anticipation of Kieran and Brian regaining their freedom. Philip Collopy was perhaps the most notorious brother, a feared enforcer whose violent exploits helped spark Limerick's gang war. As a 20-year-old in 2000, Philip was reportedly one of the gunmen who murdered Eddie Ryan, thereby initiating the feud. He developed a reputation for reckless violence, serving a 2-year sentence in 2003 for violent disorder, and in 2007, alongside his brother Ray, received a 16-month sentence for threatening to kill a man during a confrontation with rivals. Philip met a tragic end in March 2009 at age 29 when he accidentally shot himself in the head with a Glock pistol. While showing off the firearm to younger gang members at a house party, Philip removed the magazine but forgot a round remained in the chamber. He pulled the trigger and was critically wounded, dying in hospital shortly after. Vincent Collopy, born around 1979 to 1980, held a leadership role particularly in the drug supply chain. In 2006, Vincent and his brother Jonathan were caught in an undercover Garda sting, Operation Clean Street, that targeted heroin dealing. Both were convicted and each jailed for 3 years. Vincent later fled Ireland, attempting to base himself in Eastern Europe. He was arrested in 2010 in Bulgaria and extradited back to Ireland. He pleaded guilty to threatening to kill Willie Moran in June 2010 and in 2016 received a 3-year prison term for that intimidation offence. Vincent was released from prison in early 2023 after serving additional time for a cocaine dealing conviction. Damien Collopy, the youngest of the Main brothers, born in the mid-1980s, was also involved in the family business. He was about 25 years old when he joined brother Kieran in the 2010 threats against witness Moran. Both received 5-year sentences in 2011. Kenneth Collopy, despite sharing the Collopy name, was a generation younger than the brothers above, described in some accounts as their nephew or younger brother. Born around 1990, Kenneth became one of the most violent Collopy gang members of the newer generation. At just 19, he carried out a murder that shocked Limerick. On December 8, 2009, Kenneth shot dead 25-year-old Daniel Fitzgerald, an innocent carpenter, in a misguided attempt at revenge. Kenneth had fired multiple shots into a group of caravans at a halting site, believing incorrectly that someone there was responsible for an arson attack on his mother's van. Fitzgerald, who had no connection to any gang, was hit in the head and killed. Kenneth was convicted of murder in 2011 and given a mandatory life sentence. He lost an appeal in 2016, cementing his life term. As of 2025, Kenneth remained behind bars. The Collopy gang's leadership was largely a family affair, with Brian and Kieran functioning as the senior figures of the organisation in the early 2000s and 2010s, backed up by their brothers who managed various aspects of drug supply, enforcement and intimidation. Together with Christy Keane, the Keane-Collopy alliance was for many years one of the most powerful crime groups in Ireland's Midwest region, with reported connections to Dublin and Cork gangs, including an alliance with the Hutch organised crime group in Dublin. During the late 1990s, the Collopy family entered the drug trade in Limerick and partnered with the Keane gang, quickly becoming adept at distributing heroin and cannabis in the city's estates. Christy Keane was at the helm of the operation, with the Collopy brothers as trusted lieutenants. In November 2000, a feud erupted when Christy Keane's former ally, Eddie Ryan, turned on him. Ryan attempted to murder Keane by attacking him in a car outside a school, but Keane survived when the assailant's gun jammed. 2 days later, Eddie Ryan Sr. was shot dead in a pub by 2 gunmen believed to be Kieran Keane and 20-year-old Philip Collopy. This assassination was considered the opening salvo of the Keane-Collopy versus Ryan feud, marking the start of a gangland war. In 2001, Christy Keane was arrested and convicted on drug trafficking charges after being caught with a large cannabis shipment. He received a 10-year sentence. With Christy in prison and the feud widening, the Collopy faction assumed greater control over the day-to-day drug trade in their stronghold of St. Mary's Park. January 2003 witnessed a dramatic betrayal known as the Double Cross, when the rival McCarthy-Dundon gang, secretly allied with the Ryan faction, lured Christy's brother, Kieran Keane, into a trap. Kieran Keane and an associate were abducted, beaten, and taken to a rural location. Kieran Keane was tortured, stabbed in the face, and shot dead, while his nephew Owen Treacy was stabbed repeatedly and left for dead, though Treacy miraculously survived. This brutal execution was a major turning point in the feud. In the aftermath, 5 members of the McCarthy-Dundon/Ryan faction were convicted and given life sentences for Kieran Keane's murder and the attempted murder of Treacy. Between 2003 and 2004, retaliatory violence and chaos escalated. Multiple killings occurred on both sides. In October 2003, 23-year-old Michael McNamara, a Keane-Collopy gang member, was found mutilated and shot dead, likely murdered by the McCarthy-Dundon faction as revenge. During the mid-2000s, the feud peaked. The violence spiraled into a near-continuous cycle of shootings, stabbings, and bomb attacks across Limerick. By 2007, Gardaí recorded over 100 shooting incidents linked to the gang war. Homes of gang members and their relatives were routinely petrol-bombed or strafed with gunfire. Brian Collopy survived a shooting attempt in 2006, suffering gunshot wounds on Francis Street, Limerick. April 2008 saw a particularly bloody week. On April 5th, Mark Moloney, a friend of the Keane-Collopy gang, was shot dead in broad daylight outside a shop in Garryowen, believed to be a McCarthy-Dundon hit. 2 days later, the body of 20-year-old James Cronin was found buried in a shallow grave in Ballinacura Weston. Cronin had been a low-level McCarthy-Dundon associate and was killed by his own gang because his bosses feared he might crack under police pressure if arrested. In November 2008, an incident that horrified the public occurred. Popular local rugby player Shane Geoghegan, aged 28, was shot dead in a quiet suburban estate in a case of mistaken identity. Entirely uninvolved with crime, was chased and murdered by a gunman hired by the McCarthy-Dundon gang, who mistook him for a bearded Keane-Collopy associate living nearby. Public outrage in Limerick reached boiling point. Geoghegan's murder spurred increased police action and calls for tougher anti-gang measures. Early 2009 saw the cycle of violence claim more lives. In April 2009, Roy Collins, aged 35, an innocent businessman, was shot dead outside his family's pub in Limerick. This murder was ordered by Wayne Dundon as retaliation against Roy's father, Steve Collins, who had testified against the Dundons in a prior case. This killing further demonstrated how dangerously out of control the violence and vigilante retribution had become. In 2010, even as overt violence began to slow, the Collopy gang engaged in intimidation and reprisals behind the scenes. Over that year, several Collopys targeted Willie Moran, a former ally turned state witness. Brian, Kieran, Damien, and Vincent Collopy all threatened or attempted to harm Moran to stop him from testifying in an upcoming trial. Between 2011 and 2013, Irish authorities intensified efforts to dismantle Limerick's gangs following public outrage over the 2008 to 2009 murders. Dozens of gang members were arrested and prosecuted. By 2012, Gardaí announced they had fractured the gangs, with an estimated 60 key figures from both factions behind bars. High-profile convictions during this period included John Dundon, given a life sentence in 2013 for ordering Shane Geoghegan's murder, and Wayne Dundon, sentenced to life for ordering Roy Collins's murder. By August 2013, with most leadership figures off the streets, Limerick's feud was considered effectively over. The city saw a dramatic drop in gun violence. In June 2015, after a relatively peaceful interval, an attempt was made to reignite the feud when Christy Keane was shot multiple times by two gunmen as he arrived for an early morning gym session at University of Limerick. Keane, then 54, survived the assassination attempt. However, this near-death experience did not ultimately trigger a renewed feud. December 2015 saw, acting on intelligence, armed Gardaí raid a house in St. Mary's Park and catch Brian and Kieran Collopy red-handed packaging a large stash of heroin on a kitchen table. The raid yielded €50,000 worth of heroin ready to flood Limerick's streets, along with quantities of cocaine and cannabis. The Collopy brothers pleaded guilty in 2016 and each received 8 years in prison. Gardaí hailed the convictions as good news for the people of Limerick. During the mid to late 2000s, with the Collopy kingpins incarcerated and the McCarthy-Dundon leaders also in prison, Limerick enjoyed a sustained lull in gang warfare. Feuding largely ceased after 2011. No gang-related murders were recorded in some years. The Collopy gang, however, continued its drug trade through lower-level operatives. In June 2020, anticipating the release of Brian and Kieran Collopy, authorities launched Operation Coronation. Over 200 Gardaí and Irish Army personnel carried out raids on 67 premises linked to the Keane-Collopy gang across Limerick and neighbouring counties. The raids seized drug presses, large sums of cash, over €200,000 in various currencies, luxury watches and jewellery worth €100,000, documents for property in Dubai, and quantities of heroin, cocaine and cannabis. The operation aimed to disrupt the gang's finances and send a message ahead of the Collopy boss's return to society. Between 2021 and 2025, most of the Collopy brothers completed their sentences. Vincent was released from prison in late 2022 after serving about 4.5 years for a cocaine-dealing conviction. Brian and Kieran were reportedly released around 2023 to 2024 after their 8-year terms. The Limerick gangland landscape was much changed from its 2000s heyday, with many former kingpins now middle-aged and under close Garda supervision. The most defining aspect of the Collopy gang's history was its long-running feud with the rival McCarthy-Dundon gang. This bitter gang war raged roughly from 2000 to 2010 and was marked by extreme violence on both sides. It originated with the internal rift in 2000 between Keane-Collopy and Eddie Ryan, but soon expanded as the Ryan faction sought reinforcement. The McCarthy-Dundon family, led by brothers who had moved back from the UK, allied with the Ryans in a bid to seize Limerick's drug trade for themselves. They brought in heavier weaponry, including automatic firearms from contacts in England and Dublin, and aggressively went after the Keane-Collopy faction. By the early 2000s, this conflict had essentially split Limerick's underworld into two camps. On one side stood the Keane-Collopy gang, anchored in St Mary's Park on the city's north side, older established drug dealers led by Christy Keane and supported by the Collopy brothers. They were the incumbent power in Limerick's drug market. On the other side was the McCarthy-Dundon gang, based in neighbourhoods like Moyross and Ballinacurra Weston on the south side, a younger, more volatile faction led by the Dundon brothers, John, Wayne, Desi, Gerard, and their McCarthy cousins. This group quickly earned a reputation as the most feared and ruthless outfit in the region, responsible for the majority of the bloodshed during the feud. They did not hesitate to use murder as a tool of intimidation and control, even against their own ranks. The rivalry was characterized by tit-for-tat murders, drive-by shootings, stabbings, and bomb attacks. Family members on each side were targeted. Homes were shot up and burned. The feud often spared top leaders on the Collopy side. Christy Keane survived 2 attempts. Brian Collopy survived an attempt, but the Keane-Collopys endured serious losses. The murder of Kieran Keane in 2003 was a huge blow, and several junior members and associates were killed or injured over the years. Throughout the 2000s, Limerick residents lived under the shadow of this gang war. At its height, gunfire and violence became chillingly routine in certain neighbourhoods. One especially savage episode was the double-cross plot of 2003, where the Dundon-McCarthy faction betrayed and slaughtered Kieran Keane while tricking the Keane-Collopys into letting their guard down. The Dundon gang's capacity for deception and brutality in that incident solidified their status in the feud. However, the Collopy gang was not passive in this rivalry. They retaliated where possible, with the initial Eddie Ryan hit in 2000 being their opening move. Philip Collopy was a prime suspect in that murder. In the ensuing years, Collopy gunmen and enforcers were involved in numerous shootings and attempted hits on rival gang members. A particularly notable aspect of the Collopy-Dundon rivalry was the targeting of family and associates. The Dundons targeted relatives of anyone who crossed them. The murder of Roy Collins, an innocent man whose only connection was being related to a witness, exemplified this terror tactic. The Collopys and Keanes also engaged in intimidation of relatives. The feud became intergenerational as well, with younger relatives of the original players getting involved by the late 2000s. By 2010, this feud had resulted in at least 20 murders, some estimates say more, upward of 30, and hundreds of violent incidents. It turned sections of Limerick City into virtual war zones at times. The feud's endgame came not through a truce, but via relentless law enforcement pressure. By the mid-2000s, with the Dundon brothers serving life sentences and the Collopy bosses behind bars, the once intense rivalry subsided.